Chivalry, a code of conduct that evolved over centuries, a code that embodies the ideals of knighthood, valor, and honor. Originating in medieval Europe, chivalry encompassed a complex set of virtues, but also obligations that shaped the behavior of knights on and off the battlefield. While it's often romanticized in literature and legend, the historical development and practical implications of chivalry reveal somewhat of a nuanced and dynamic system that adapted to the social and political trends of the Middle Ages. Hello and welcome to the channel. If you're new here, it's good to meet you. And if you're coming back, it's great to have you again. If you'd like to support the channel, as always, check out the Patreon. Otherwise, a like, comment, and subscribe certainly goes a long way. Now, without further ado, let's talk about the Code of Chivalry. First of all, what is that word, chivalry? Well, the term chivalry originates from the old French word chevalerie, which literally translates to horse soldiery. Originally, it referred to a specific subsection of horse-mounted warriors, as indicated by the French word for a horse, cheval. However, over time, it became associated with the ideals and values of knighthood. In its earliest use, the French word chevalier meant a man of aristocratic standing, possibly of noble lineage, who possessed the capability, when needed, to equip himself with a war horse and the weapons of a heavy cavalryman, and who has also undergone certain rituals that confer upon him this status. Hence, during the medieval period, the plural form of chivalry, which later transformed into the English word chivalry, originally referred to the collective body of heavy cavalry when assembled for a battle. But as time passed, the meaning of the term expanded to encompass a more broader sense. During the Middle Ages, chevalier evolved from its original concrete military definition to represent the ideal of Christian warrior ethos, which was popularized in the burgeoning Romance genre of the 12th century. Additionally, it became associated with the concept of courtly love, which was promoted in contemporary poetry and music, such as, for example, the Minnesang. Now, these evolving ideals of chivalry emphasized virtues such as bravery, loyalty, honor, and respect for women. The principles of chivalry are encapsulated in 3 separate medieval works, each offering their unique perspective on the concept. An anonymous poem, Ordine de Chivalry, recounts the tale of Hugh II of Tiberias, who was captured by Saladin and released after agreeing to demonstrate the rituals of Christian knighthood. The poem sheds light on the rituals and customs associated with knighthood during the Crusades. The next one, Liber del Order de Cavalleria, authored by Raymond Lull from Majorca, delves into the subject of knighthood in general. Lull's work explores the various aspects of being a knight, likely influenced by the chivalric ideals prevalent during his time. And finally, Geoffrey de Charnay's Livre de Chivalry examines the qualities and attributes expected of knights, with a particular emphasis on prowess and martial skill. Chanet's work provides insight into the ideals and values upheld by knights during the late medieval period. Interestingly, none of these authors were aware of each other's works, yet their writings collectively contribute to a broader understanding of the concept of chivalry. And while each text approaches the concept from a different angle, they collectively depict chivalry as a way of life integrating military service, nobility, and of course, religious observance. The development of the Code of Chivalry occurred during the late Middle Ages, evolving in the aftermath of the Crusades. Influenced by both the historical deeds of knights in the Holy Land and these romanticized ideals of courtly love, the Code of Chivalry became a guiding ethos for knights, emphasizing virtues such as loyalty and compassion to others. Léon Gautier, a pioneering French literary historian, compiled what he referred to as the medieval 10 Commandments of Chivalry in his book Chivalry, published originally in 1884. These commandments encapsulate the core values and principles expected of knights during the medieval period. They provide a very good insight into the ethical code that governed the conduct of knights and shaped their ideals of honor and nobility. So, these, outlined by Gautier, the 10 Commandments of Chivalry, are as follows, and I'll read them in no particular order. Thou shalt believe all that the Church teaches, and shalt observe all of its directions. This commandment emphasizes the importance of religious faith and obedience to the teachings of the Church. All knights were expected to uphold and defend the Christian faith with no exceptions, and their actions were mostly guided by religious principles. Thou shalt defend the Church. More or less the same. Knights were seen as champions of the Church system, and they were expected to come to the aid to safeguard the Church's interests, both on and off the battlefield, and in war and peace. The Church was effectively the boss. Thou shalt respect all weaknesses, and shalt constitute thyself the defender of them. Now this one sounds a little tricky. What it means is that this commandment is underscoring the chivalric virtue of compassion and empathy towards others. Knights were expected to show kindness and mercy towards the weak, including women and especially children and the elderly. And it was thought that it was the priority of a knight to defend women from harm. Thou shalt love the country in which one was born. Of course, knights all had to be loyal to their homeland, and they were duty-bound to defend it against enemies, from without or within. Patriotism and loyalty were essential virtues of chivalry. Thou shalt not recoil before thine enemy. Courage and bravery in the face of danger were paramount virtues for knights. They were expected to confront their enemies with valor and resolve, and never back down from a challenge. Thou shalt make war against the infidel without cessation and without mercy. Now this command reflects the religious fervor of the Crusades era, during which knights were called upon to wage holy war against the infidels in the name of the Christian Church. Of course, that simplifies it a little too much. The Crusades mainly came about to protect pilgrims who were being attacked along the roads heading to Jerusalem and other holy sites. Groups like the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller were set up to effectively protect them. And, of course, part of protecting the pilgrims is fighting against the infidel. So I suppose that's where that comes from. It was also a political thing. The knights certainly had to be reminded of who the good guys and the bad guys were. There was no thinking outside this box. That being said, Saladin, the one who was meant to be the enemy, was universally respected, at least via many sources, reckoning by a lot of the European knights, as for him expelling the virtues of what a chivalric person would do. I have a whole video on Saladin if you want to learn more about that. Moving on. Thou shalt perform scrupulously thy feudal duties, if they be not contrary to the laws of God. Knights had feudal obligations to their lords, including military service and loyalty. However, these duties were expected to align with the laws and principles of the Church. Knights were to fulfill their feudal obligations faithfully while upholding their religious convictions. Thou shalt never lie, and shalt remain faithful to thy pledged word. Honesty, integrity, and honor, all fundamental virtues. Knights were expected to uphold their word and act with honesty and integrity, not just in military matters, but in all of their dealings, both on and off the battlefield. Of course, this falls into line with observing the Christian ethics of not bearing false witness. Thou shalt be generous, and give largesse to everyone. Generosity and magnanimity were esteemed virtues of a chivalrous knight. Therefore, they were expected to be generous in all of their actions, and give freely to those in need. This includes their vassals, allies, and even outstretching a helping hand to the less fortunate. Thou shalt be everywhere, and always be the champion of the right and the good against injustice and evil. This commandment embodies the overarching duty of knights to uphold justice and righteousness. They were expected to stand up for what is right and oppose injustice and evil wherever they encountered it, embodying the ideas of true chivalry. So, these 10 commandments, if we can say it like that, while certainly catalogued at a later date, they provide a moral and ethical framework for knights to follow, guiding their behavior both on and off the battlefield. They encapsulated the majority of the noble ideals and values, giving us a pretty good roadmap of what a knight should and should not be doing. Of course, not all knights were following this to the T, and there were a lot of knights who thought that these kind of restrictions were somewhat stifling. Historians have offered varying perspectives on chivalry, challenging the traditional view of it as purely a civilizing and stabilizing force in a rather chaotic Middle Age. Now, contrary to this portrayal, some scholars argued that the role of knights in maintaining public order was complex, but often somewhat problematic. Ugh, I hate that word. While they contend that while chivalric codes and ideals provided guidance to knights, they were also riddled with contradictions, and did not always lead to a more ordered and peaceful society. Well, the ambivalent and sometimes disruptive role played by knights in medieval European society was indeed an issue to be contended with. The ideals of chivalry were not always aligned with the interests of public order and stability. The conception of medieval society, comprising of those who pray, those who fight, and those who work, seem to be in conjunction with knighthood, but also pose challenges to the establishment of social harmony. This world view of knights, rooted in martial values and pre-Christian traditions, often clashed with the objectives of the church and monarchy. Indeed, if you've watched my video on knights in general, you'll know that a lot of these traditions do go back to Roman times. So, perhaps I should have told you at the start of the video to watch that first. But here we are 20 minutes in. There's no turning back now, isn't there? Well, I digress. The church sought to reform and guide knights, mold them into their image, recognizing the need to temper the disorderly and chauvinistic elements of chivalry. Similarly, royalty encountered conflict with knights over matters of warfare and personal disputes. Here's the other thing. When you're a knight, you're kind of known as the local tough guy, right? So, when somebody gives you a raw deal, there's only really one way of dealing with it. Well, of course, you're bogged down by this series of rules that you are meant to follow. But you're sick of being told what to do. Indeed, a lot of knights had no doubt felt this way. Just a bit of speculation, but I certainly would have. Well, moreover, emerging merchant class and the bourgeois, representing the social and economic forces of this growing modernity, seem to be at odds with the values of chivalry. The knights, driven by notions of value and honor, viewed the values of commerce as inferior, and sometimes resorted to violence against those engaged in trade. And here's another thing. Merchants in these times were often seen in some places as less than a farmer. Well, why is that? Surely a merchant's doing pretty well. Well, yes, they are. But the merchant doesn't produce anything. He does not create anything. He simply takes something from someone else and sells it at a higher price. He is a middleman, and many people saw these people as parasites. Well, some historians also raise skepticism about early writers on medieval chivalry, cautioning that their accounts may be colored by polemical agendas. Writers often viewed chivalry as a means to reform corrupt secular society, and emphasized its origins in the Teutonic forests brought into civilization by the great and wonderful Catholic Church. Others, however, view chivalry as a social rather than a military phenomenon, focusing on its key features such as generosity, fidelity, liberality, and courtesy. They portray chivalry as somewhat of an ethical inheritance that shaped the behavior of individuals and provided a moral framework for social interaction, an ideal for those unwashed masses to aspire to. Now, before the emergence of codified chivalry, there existed an uncodified note of noble conduct centered around the concept of the prud'homme, which can sort of be translated as a wise, honest, and sensible man. This unwritten code, known as the noble habitus, encompassed the behavioral and material expectations that were prevalent in medieval societies, and not just in the upper classes, but indeed across all social platforms. Now, this concept of noble habitus as a modern idea was pioneered by the French philosopher-sociologists in our modern era Pierre Bourdieu and Maurice Merleau-Ponty, although its roots can be traced back to works as ancient as those of Aristotle. It represents this set of social norms and expectations that govern the behavior of aristocratic individuals, emphasizing qualities such as wisdom, honesty, and sensibility. More or less, if we were going to boil it down, we would say that it was almost a secularized form of universally preferable behavior. Good manners, if you will. Going back to that golden rule that is prevalent in all cultures, treat others how you would like to be treated. Well, the pre-chivalric noble habitus, as discovered by historians and elaborated upon by scholars, encompasses several key principles, which I will go through briefly now. The first being loyalty. This virtue was considered a practical utility among warrior nobility, closely associated with prowess on the battlefield, highlighting the importance of reputation for loyalty in noble conduct. Secondly, forbearance. Knights were expected to exercise self-control, not only in combat, but also at the courts of their lords. The early noble habitus emphasized the nobility of mercy and forbearance, as evidenced by historical documents, such as the Conventum of Hugh de Lusignan of the 1020s. And of course, these qualities were well established before the formalization of chivalry, so it wasn't really reinventing the wheel, just writing it down. The next one is hardiness. Physical resilience and prowess in warfare were essential components. Exceptional physical prowess on the battlefield often led to attaining noble knightly status. Indeed, usually you would have to be from a noble family to become a knight. Either your father was a knight or you were born of somewhat noble stock. However, if you were noticed by a commander or a general on the battlefield for exemplifying extreme courage, or perhaps just managing to murder a lot of people in a very short amount of time, then you could perhaps get a glowing commendation and go up in the ranks, moving from peasant to slightly more well-dressed peasant. largesse or liberality. Generosity was, of course, once again considered a very noble quality, with liberality representing one of the noble virtues. And it wasn't just about merely giving possessions away, but one was also expected to look at those greedy elements of society with a good deal of contempt, to look down upon those who hoarded things for themselves. Next one is the Davidic ethic. Now, what is the Davidic ethic? Well, it's derived from biblical tradition. The concept encompasses noble qualities such as safeguarding the vulnerable, ensuring justice for widows and orphans especially, and in general opposing cruelty and injustice. The ideal warrior leader is portrayed as a guardian protector, committed to upholding ethical principles and demonstrating benevolence towards the weak. There was none of this Gaston-esque sort of character. Well, at least there wasn't meant to be. Knights were expected to always be humble. Which leads us to the last one, honor. Achieving honor was closely tied to living up to the ideals of the prud'homme and embodying all of the virtues listed above. Not some of them, not most of them, but all of them. If you were a very great warrior, but you were cruel to your servants, or you looked down upon the poor, held your nose as you walked past the peasant working the field, then you were not considered a very good knight. If you slayed innocents, or lent people money at high interest, that's a big no-no in the Middle Ages, by the way. You get thrown down the well for usury. Well, that also means that you weren't a very good knight. Also, if you acted very, very nicely to everybody, rode around on your horse flicking coins to people, and generally being a nice guy, that was great, but when the call to arms rang out, if you weren't the first on the field, well, you'd lost your qualification, friend. All of these principles formed that base foundation of the pre-chivalric noble habitus, and laid the groundwork for the development of the formal Code of Chivalry in the later medieval period. Courtly behavior remained a recognized form of superior conduct in medieval European society throughout the Middle Ages. It was expected of all aristocrats, and its norms were integrated in chivalric literature. However, unlike chivalry, courtliness was not confined to noble society alone. Examples can be found of servants, merchants, clergy, and free peasants being commended for their courtly behavior in medieval literature. This broader application of courtly behavior suggests its widespread influence across various social classes. Now, the emergence of chivalry as a recognizable and prescriptive code of behavior can be tied to a more exclusive definition of nobility that emerged around the late 12th century. This had a significant impact on the professional horse warrior, the knight. Retained knights were prominent figures in the households of barons, counts, and princes, and were considered proper associates of their lords. As such, knights adopted the fashions and behaviors of their lords. Many knights were drawn from the younger sons of noble families, leading them to regard themselves as noble, albeit of lower status than their lords. The tipping point of the nobilizing of the knight is often located in the households of the sons of King Henry II of England, particularly his eldest son, Henry the Young, died in 1183. Died quite young, by the way. Young Henry lived a lavish lifestyle, focused on the great northern French tourneying society of the 1170s and 80s, funded by his father to distract him from meddling in his realms and to stake a claim to cultural superiority over other European princes. Now, despite criticism, and I mean widespread criticism, for his wasteful and hedonistic lifestyle, young Henry played a significant role in the development of chivalry as a noble code. The De Re Militari of Ralph Niger, circa 1187, the first known work to use the knight as a moral exemplar and definitive nobleman, was written by the young man's former chaplain, partly as a moral defense of the knightly lifestyle. Another reason for the coalescence of chivalry as a noble code in the late 12th century is suggested by an analysis of conduct literature. The courtly habitus underwent a crisis as its moral failures became evident to writers, particularly in the materialism that motivated courtly society. They're rich people. Come on. The Roman Diel's poet knight Raoul de Hodanc is seen as a critique of courtliness and its failures. Raoul's solution is to focus moral eminence on the figure of the knight, who is to be the avatar of a new moral nobility, set above all other males. A knight was expected to eschew materialism and embrace noble generosity. So, by this time, in medieval literature, chivalry's fairly depicted through 3 overlapping areas, each highlighting different duties and virtues. Duties to countrymen and fellow Christians. This encompasses virtues such as mercy, fairness and protection of the weak and poor, and the loyalty of the knight to his lord. It involves, and rather emphasizes, being willing to sacrifice one's life for others, whether it be for a lord or for a poor individual. Certainly a knight is expected to run into a burning building to save the maiden. Next up, duties to God. Of course, knights are meant to be agents of the church, Christian warriors, protecting the innocent, defending the church and championing good against evil, all while prioritizing obedience to God above loyalty to one's feudal lord. Duties to women. Now this is perhaps the most recognizable aspect of chivalry. It includes the concept of courtly love. Knights are expected to serve a lady, placing her above all others, and to exhibit gentleness and graciousness towards all women. There's a reason why we call gentlemanly conduct in the modern era as chivalrous. And of course, any man worth his salt wants to be as much of a gentleman as possible. Right, guys? Well, all of these emphasis placed on these different areas resulted in different strands of chivalry, each with its own focus and ideals. The first up being warrior chivalry. Now in this strand, a knight's primary duty is to his lord. It's exemplified by characters like Sir Gawain in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and the wedding of Sir Gawain and Dame Ragnell. Anybody who is a fan of the Bretonians in Warhammer Fantasy must leave a comment, so we can perhaps summon the Green Knight to the field. Next up, religious chivalry. Here, a knight's chief obligation is to protect the innocent and serve God. It conjures to mind figures such as Sir Percival and Sir Galahad of the Grail legends, that certainly embody this form of chivalry to its core. And then there is, of course, the romantic ideal of the chivalrous, courtly love. It emphasizes a knight's unwavering devotion to his own lady, and by extension protecting the honor of all women. Think about it this way. If you have a beautiful young lady who is having trouble carrying her shopping to her car, and an old woman who's having the same trouble, a knight, at least in this sense, should be treating that situation with equal importance, not just running to the young, beautiful girl. Now, with the emergence of the knight's character and the chivalric ethos came several novel elements that reshaped medieval society. The first up was the revised social status, with knights now occupying a unique position in medieval society, somewhere between the nobility and the commoners. Not quite nobility just yet. While their adherence to chivalric codes and their role as protectors elevated their social standing and distinguished them from the other classes within feudal society. Of course, the next part was the innovation of military tactics. You see, chivalric codes introduced regulations that governed warfare, emphasizing principles such as loyalty to the overlord and adherence to rules of engagement, which was great when you were fighting other knights. But fighting enemies who had no idea what that was and would not fight fair, well, different tactics needed to be utilized. Next thing we had was fresh literary themes. Now, the ideals of chivalry inspired a rich vein of literature, including epic poems, romances, and the tales of knightly valor. These literary works often portrayed knights as paragons of virtue, embodying ideals such as courage, loyalty, honor, and mercy. And indeed, it was more or less based on a true story. For example, in the battlefield, knights were expected to never attack a defenseless opponent, and prioritize the capture of fellow nobles for ransom, while not causing them immediate harm. They were also expected to treat prisoners of war well. So, a lot of these ideas coming from the literary depictions of knights were indeed based on their real-world counterparts, albeit somewhat blown out of proportion. It's literature. There's always a dramatic license. Now, throughout the medieval period, martial exercise and military virtue remained integral components. However, as warfare evolved, the role of knights on the battlefield began to shift. increasingly restricting their activities to tournament grounds and dueling culture. The joust. It certainly conjures that image to mind, doesn't it? Continued to serve as a prominent display of knightly martial skill well into the Renaissance era. Additionally, the martial skills of knights extended beyond the battlefield to activities such as hunting. Expertise in this area became an essential aspect of courtly life during the later medieval period. Furthermore, the practice of heraldry, with its elaborate rules governing the displays of coats of arms, emerged alongside chivalry during the High Middle Ages. Heraldry served as a visual representation of a knight's lineage, achievements, and allegiances, further solidifying the connection between chivalry and aristocratic identity. Of course, Christianity was the big one that shaped the concept of chivalry, infusing those classical notions of heroism and self-sacrifice with Christian ideals. It can be observed in several key developments. The peace and truce with God. Instituted in the 10th century, this placed restrictions on knights, compelling them to protect and honor the weaker members of society while aiding the church in maintaining peace. The just war theory. The church became more tolerant of war in defense of faith and developed theories of the just and righteous war, which sought to establish ethical guidelines for warfare. Liturgies were introduced to bless a knight's sword and symbolize chivalric purification bath, imbuing military actions with religious significance. And here's a fun fact for you. In some kingdoms of the Middle Ages, priests were forbidden from fighting. As a matter of fact, the rule was they were forbidden from drawing blood. So, many people got around this by simply using a mace. Now, if you hit somebody hard enough with a mace, there's certainly going to be bleeding, especially those big maces that they were using. But rules are meant to be broken, aren't they? And so are jaws, apparently. Just ask some medieval priests about that. Now, the next one is chivalry as a Christian vocation. In medieval literature such as the Grail romances and Chevalier en Cygne, chivalry was depicted as an order of God, with knights viewing their way of life, simply doing chivalry, as a means of pleasing God. It combined Teutonic heroic values with the militant tradition of the Old Testament. The concept of the Knight of Christ gained prominence in France, Spain, and Italy in the 11th century. That notion of religious chivalry was further developed during the Crusades, which were simply portrayed as chivalrous enterprises. Chivalric orders, including the Teutonic Knights of Germany, revered the Virgin Mary as their patroness. The development of chivalry, with its emphasis on the honor of a lady and knightly devotion, was certainly influenced by the cult of Mary. She served as a symbol of purity, compassion, and refuge. Kind of like a mummy, you know. Well, she shaped medieval attitudes towards women and contributing the development of Mariology. Think about it. Respect for women. You wouldn't disrespect a woman, wouldn't you? The Virgin Mary is a woman. It was kind of like that. Well, all in all, chivalry was a dynamic and adaptable code of conduct that evolved in response to local circumstances. Everyone's code of chivalry was a little bit different. It changed from France to Germany to Poland to really everywhere. In the late 15th century England, Sir Thomas Malory depicted numerous chivalric groups in his work The Death of Arthur, suggesting that each group had its own unique chivalric ideology. When The Death of Arthur was printed, William Caxton encouraged knights to read it, with the hope that the stories of chivalry could serve as a unifying force for the knightly community that was already fragmented by the Wars of the Roses. And during the early Tudor period of England, some knights still adhered to chivalric ethos, although fewer were actively engaged in warfare. The emergence of professional infantrymen on the battlefield somewhat reduced the opportunities for knights to demonstrate their chivalrous action, and the decline of chivalry was further accelerated by Queen Elizabeth I's decision to reserve the power to create knights exclusively for the monarchy, ending the tradition of knights being able to create other knights. Some argue that Sir Edward Woodville, who travelled across Europe engaging in battles and died in 1488, was one of the last knight-errants to witness the transition from the age of chivalry to modern European warfare. Well, whichever the case is, as the Middle Ages drew to a close, the code of chivalry gradually faded away, no longer serving as the guiding ethos it once was. So, looking back on what we've learned about chivalry, I've recently made a video about the East Asian counterpart, Bushido, which I believe that both of these ethoses have their good parts and bad parts. Now, in terms of chivalry, the observance of that golden rule in our Christian theology of treating others how you would want to be treated, well, it's a bit of an obvious one, isn't it? We don't need a code of chivalry for that. But the interesting thing about the code of chivalry to me that really kills it is the unquestioning adherence to the church. Now, if we are going to make the rule that serve God, serve the Bible, and serve what has been given to us at the Sermon on the Mount, fair enough. But if we are going to place it back into the hands of an entity that can be controlled and changed by the whims of human elements, such as the church, well, then things get a little dangerous, especially when they can tell you who to go and kill. And with that, I think that's enough of a talk about chivalry for today. But reflect upon it. Think about how you can be a little chivalrous in your own life. Just don't go riding any horses into battle anytime soon, thank you. Now, I'd like to thank my Mega Chat tier patrons, that being Stark Factory, and the old JC. No, not Jesus Christ. The other JC. And I would like to thank you for listening this far. If you'd like to support the channel, then perhaps you'd like to look at the Patreon, check out the merch, or simply like, comment, and subscribe. It all helps YouTube push me out to a bigger audience. And my goodness, the channel is growing. We're at over 3,000 subs now. I think we'll get to 5,000 before the end of next month. Tell your friends. Thank you for listening, and once again, I will see you in the next video. Good night, everyone.